A single sentence can make a billion-dollar empire crumble like a house of cards. For Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old waitress struggling to pay her mother's medical bills, that sentence was an innocent observation. For Patrick Vance Montgomery, a magnate protected from the world by billions of dollars, it was a crack in the foundation of his entire life. She was just trying to finish her shift. He was just another titan in an expensive suit. But when she saw the signature on the document he was proudly displaying, a flash of memory turned into an inferno that would threaten to burn a centuries-old dynasty. "Sir?" she said, her voice trembling. "That is my father's signature." The crystal glass slipped from Patrick's hands as if he had seen a ghost, because, in a way, he had. This is not a story of coincidence. It is the story of how a casual observation in an elegant restaurant unraveled a web of lies, betrayal, and a secret one of the most powerful families in the United States believed was buried forever. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The golden lights of the gilded lantern hummed with a monotonous melody, a sound Sarah Jenkins knew better than her own heartbeat. It was the soundtrack to her life, the sizzle of seafood on the grill, the clatter of expensive ceramic plates, the low murmur of conversations that never seemed to change. At 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, the New York City restaurant was in its usual nightly lull, a brief respite between the dinner rush and the late-night crowd. Sarah leaned against the cold stainless steel surface of the counter, rolling her shoulders to work out a knot of exhaustion. Every muscle ached with a fatigue that was more than physical. It was the deep, soul weariness of watching her mother, Carol, fade away slowly in a sterile beige hospital room. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. A man entered, and an invisible curtain of silence seemed to fall over the restaurant. He wasn't just well-dressed. He was sculpted from a different material than the rest of the world. His suit, a charcoal gray so dark it was almost black, fit him with the precision of a scalpel. His shoes shined even under the dim restaurant lights. He had the kind of quiet, absolute confidence that doesn't need to be announced. It just is. The few remaining patrons instinctively lowered their voices. He chose a booth in the corner, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat with an economy of motion. Sarah picked up a menu and a water glass, her professional smile pasted on her face. "Welcome to the Gilded Lantern. Can I get you something to start?" The man didn't look at the menu. His eyes, a shockingly clear blue, met hers for a brief, dismissive moment. "Just coffee, black." His voice was low and resonant, a cello in a room of tin whistles. "Right away, sir," Sarah said, retreating to the counter. Her friend and fellow waitress, Amanda, sidled up to her. "Get a load of Mr. Billionaire," Amanda muttered. "Thinks he's too good for the menu. I bet you $20 that's Patrick Vance Montgomery." Sarah frowned as she poured the coffee. "Who? Patrick Vance Montgomery?" "Montgomery Holdings International. They own half the downtown skyline. My dad used to be a foreman on one of their construction sites before they laid him off. That guy's picture is in the business section every other week. They say he's ruthless. Turned his family's millions into billions before he was 30. Sarah glanced back at the man. He was staring out the window, his profile sharp and severe against the neon-lit street. He looked less like a businessman and more like a predator resting between hunts. She picked up the cup and saucer. "Well, to me, he's just another customer who wants black coffee." She returned to the table and set the coffee down. "Here you are, sir." As he reached for the cup, his hand emerged from his monogrammed cuff. And on his ring finger, nestled against his skin, was a ring that made Sarah's breath catch. It wasn't the size or the sparkle that stopped her. It was the design, an intricate masculine signet ring made of pale gold. Etched into the flat face was an emblem, a stylized phoenix with its wings outstretched, a tiny sapphire embedded in its eye, glinting like a captured star. The band itself was unique, carved to look like interlocking feathers. Sarah's mind reeled. She'd seen that exact ring, not shining under restaurant lights, but resting in a small, velvet-lined box on her mother's nightstand. Carol's ring was identical in every detail, down to the tiny, impossibly blue sapphire eye. It was her most prized possession, the one thing she had refused to sell, even as the medical bills became a wave threatening to drown them. "Your grandfather," she had always said. gave it to me on his deathbed. It's a promise, Sarah, she would whisper, her voice thin and reedy. A promise of what is right. The words slipped out of Sarah's mouth before she could stop them, a quiet, stunned whisper. Excuse me, sir. My mother has a ring exactly like yours. Patrick Vance Montgomery froze, his hand suspended over the coffee cup. Slowly, he drew it back, and his piercing blue eyes rose to meet hers. The casual disdain was gone, replaced by a sudden glacial intensity. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his gaze so sharp and analytical she felt like he was dissecting her, searching for the punchline to a joke she wasn't telling. Excuse me? He said finally, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously smooth. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt Amanda's worried stare from across the room. She should have walked away, kept her mouth shut, but the image of her mother's frail hand clutching that identical ring was seared into her mind. The ring, she stammered, pointing with a trembling finger at his hand. It's just like my mother's. The phoenix, the little sapphire, everything. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not surprise, not recognition, but something harder, darker. He slowly turned his hand, examining the ring as if seeing it for the first time. That's impossible, he declared. It wasn't a guess. It was a verdict. This ring has been in the Montgomery family for over 100 years. It was custom-made for my great-grandfather, Alexander Vance Montgomery. Only one exists. There has never been another. You are mistaken. The finality in his tone felt like a slap. He was calling her a liar, or worse, a fool. The injustice of it, piled on top of her exhaustion and fear for her mother, ignited a spark of defiance. I'm not mistaken, she said, her voice low but steady. I've held it in my hands 1,000 times. I know every detail. I could draw it from memory. He leaned back, a faint, condescending smirk touching his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. A fascinating story. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. Well, Ms. Jenkins, he said, picking up his coffee cup and taking a slow, deliberate sip. Your mother is either a liar or a thief, because the only way she has a ring like this is if it's the one that was stolen from my family 50 years ago. He set the cup down with a soft click. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of Sarah's world. Stolen. The word hung in the air, thick and venomous. Her mother, the gentlest, most honest person she knew, a thief? The accusation was so absurd, so vile. It was like being told the sun rose in the west. Patrick Vance Montgomery reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and extracted 3 $100 bills, placing them on the table. It was more than she made in 2 shifts. It was an insult, a dismissal, for the coffee. And your time, he said, his eyes already looking past her toward the door. He stood, the power of his presence filling the small booth. He was already gone, moving on, leaving her in the wreckage of his words. As he walked to the exit, Sarah found her voice. She's not a thief. He paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't turn, but his voice carried clearly across the silent restaurant. Then prove it. The bell chimed again, and he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the gilded lantern, her heart pounding, the hum of the lights now sounding like a scream. The 3 crisp bills on the table felt like blood money. She hadn't just served coffee to a billionaire. She had just stumbled into a story, his story. And in doing so, she realized with a cold dread she might have just destroyed her own. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and the anxious thrum of her own heart. Patrick Vance Montgomery's words echoed in her head. A liar or a thief? It was preposterous. Carol Jenkins was a woman who would go back to a store to return a few cents of extra change. The accusation was a poisoned dart, and Sarah felt its venom spreading through her. She found her mother sleeping, her face pale and sunken against the stark white of the hospital pillow. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a frail, rhythmic reassurance. On the small bedside table, next to a plastic cup of water and a well-worn book of poetry, was the small dark blue velvet box. With trembling hands, Sarah picked it up. The velvet was worn smooth in places. She opened the lid. There it was. The pale gold ring caught the low light from the hallway. The phoenix with its proud, spread wings, and the eye, a tiny sapphire that seemed to hold a universe of secrets. It was identical. There was no doubt. "Sarah, honey, is that you?" Carol's voice was weak, papery. Sarah quickly shut the box and turned, forcing a smile. "Hey, Mom, didn't mean to wake you. You're late. Tough shift?" Carol's eyes, though clouded by illness, were still sharp, still full of the fierce love that had been Sarah's anchor her entire life. The usual. Sarah couldn't bring herself to say the truth. How could she speak such a monstrous accusation to this frail woman? "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a very slow, very expensive truck," Carol said with a weak smile. The doctors were in. More talk about options. It all sounds the same. She shifted in the bed, wincing, and her eyes fell on the box in Sarah's hand. Her expression changed. The weariness was replaced by a familiar, guarded look. "You were looking at the ring. Yeah," Sarah faltered. "I was just thinking about him. About Dad." Carol's hand, thin and cross-hatched with blue veins, reached out and patted the mattress beside her. Sarah sat down. "Your grandfather," Carol corrected gently, as she always did. "It was my father who gave it to me, not yours." Sarah knew this. Sarah's father had been a good man, a mechanic who died in a workshop accident when she was 10, leaving behind only debts and happy memories. The ring predated him. "Right. Grandpa," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Mom, tell me about him again." "About the ring." Carol's gaze drifted to the window, to the dark American sky outside. "There isn't much to tell you haven't heard. My father, Edward, was a quiet man. A brilliant man. An engineer. He worked for a big corporation back east. He said the ring was payment for a promise that was broken by powerful men." "What kind of promise?" Sarah pressed, trying to keep her voice casual. "He never said, only that it was about acknowledging what was right. He made me swear never to sell it, to keep it safe. He said, one day this might be the only proof we have." "Proof of what?" A flash of real intense fear crossed Carol's face. She looked at Sarah, her eyes pleading. "Let it go, Sarah. It's an old story. A sad story. It has nothing to do with us anymore. Some doors are better left closed. But Mom, what if someone else has a reason to open that door?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Carol's grip on her hand tightened. "What do you mean? What happened?" Sarah saw the spike on the heart monitor and cursed herself. She couldn't burden her mother with this. Not now. She needed to protect her. "Nothing. It's nothing, just something stupid at work." But the seed of doubt had been planted, a promise broken by powerful men. Who were they? And what did it have to do with Patrick Vance Montgomery? Miles away, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city, Patrick Vance Montgomery stood before a floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights spread out below him like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid untouched. He hadn't been able to shake the encounter at the restaurant. The girl. Sarah Jenkins, her wide, honest eyes, her absolute certainty. "My mother has a ring exactly like yours." It was ridiculous. He strode to a heavy mahogany desk and switched on a green-shaded banker's lamp. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a leather-bound folder. The Montgomery family archives. It was a curated, sanitized history, of course, but it was all he had. He opened it to the section on family heirlooms. There, on a yellowed page, was a photograph of the ring. His ring. The description was clear. The Phoenix signet. Commissioned 1922 by Alexander Vance Montgomery. Forged by artisan Michel Dubois of Paris. Unique design. Symbol of the Montgomery family's rise from the ashes of the 1921 financial panic. Sole property, passed to the male heir of each generation. His father had given it to him on his 21st birthday. "It represents our resilience, Patrick," his father had said, his voice thick with pride. "We always rise. Never forget that." Patrick's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen. "Genevieve Adler," he answered. "You're awake," came a crisp, no-nonsense voice. Genevieve Adler was more than his lawyer. She was his fixer, the executor of his will and the keeper of his secrets. "Something's come up," Patrick said, his voice tight. "I need you to run a discreet background check." "Another hostile takeover?" "A person. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. Works at a restaurant on 6th Street called the Gilded Lantern. Her mother's name is Carol Jenkins. I want to know everything." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Genevieve was too professional to ask why, but he could feel her curiosity. "Is this a personal or professional matter, Patrick?" Patrick looked at the ring on his finger, the phoenix staring back at him with its cold sapphire eye. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty. "But it has the potential to become problematic." He thought of the story his grandfather used to tell. A story told only in hushed tones after a few too many brandies, about Alexander's younger brother, Stephen, how Stephen had betrayed the family, had tried to steal Alexander's designs for a new kind of turbine engine, and in his greed, had taken the spare signet ring Alexander had foolishly commissioned. Stephen, the story went, was disinherited, cast out, and the ring was lost with him, a symbol of treachery. But the official family history, the one in the folder, never mentioned a second ring. It never mentioned a brother named Stephen. It was a ghost story, a family legend, until now. "Find out who Carol Jenkins's father was," Patrick commanded, his voice hardening again. "I want his name. I want to know what he worked on, and I want to know if he ever, for any reason, crossed paths with my family." He hung up the phone. The waitress had told him to prove it, but he now realized with a grim certainty that he had to do the same. He had to prove that his own history was the truth. But what he discovered next would change his life forever. 3 days later, the name came in a single encrypted line of text from Genevieve Adler, Edward Miller. The name meant nothing to Patrick. He ran it through Montgomery Holdings' private databases, cross-referencing it with employee records, contractor lists, and financial dealings going back a century. Nothing. No Edward Miller had ever worked for, or with his family's company. He felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by suspicion. It was too clean. He was brooding in his office, a vast expanse of glass and steel on the 80th floor, when Genevieve appeared at his door. She was a severe woman in her 50s, always dressed in impeccably tailored suits, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, glossy bun. She held a thin file. "You're not going to like this," she said by way of greeting. She placed the file on his desk. Patrick opened it. Inside were public records. A birth certificate for Carol Ann Miller, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Father, Edward Miller. Mother, Elena Miller. And then another document. A patent application from 1968. Inventor, Edward Miller. Invention, a novel gearing system for high-torque industrial turbines. Patent number XXXXX. Application withdrawn. Patrick's blood ran cold. He recognized the schematic. It was a primitive, but unmistakable, precursor to the Montgomery Mark III turbine. The very invention that had catapulted his grandfather's company from a regional player to a global powerhouse in the early 70s. The application was withdrawn on October 12, 1968, Genevieve said, her voice flat. According to bank records I accessed, on October 14, 1968, Edward Miller made a one-time cash deposit of $50,000 into his savings account, a significant sum for an engineer at the time. He quit his job a week later, moved his family, and never worked in engineering again. He died of a heart attack 6 years later, at 42. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. A non-disclosure agreement, a cash payoff, a brilliant idea, bought and buried under the Montgomery name. "So he was bought off," Patrick said, the words tasting like ash. "My grandfather stole his invention and paid him to shut up." "It looks that way," Genevieve confirmed. "The $50,000 was likely filed as a consulting fee to keep it legal. There's no paper trail linking him directly to the patent. Your grandfather was meticulous, of course. And the ring?" Patrick asked, staring at his own hand. "That," Genevieve said, "is where it gets strange." She slid a translated copy across the desk. "I tracked down the jeweler who bought the assets of Dubois et Fils of Paris. The records are ancient, but their ledgers were like your grandfather, meticulous. In 1922, Alexander Vance Montgomery commissioned 2 identical Phoenix signet rings. He paid for both. The notation reads, 1 for the builder, 1 for the dreamer. May they fly together. 2 rings. The family ghost story wasn't a story. It was true." "So Miller didn't steal the ring," Patrick muttered, thinking aloud. "The disinherited brother Stephen must have." "But why?" The knowledge was a corrosive acid in his gut. His family legacy wasn't built on resilience alone, but on a lie. He had to speak to her again. Sarah was wiping down the counter at the end of another grueling shift when the bell on the door chimed. Her heart sank. It was him. Patrick Vance Montgomery didn't enter the restaurant this time. He stood in the doorway, the city lights framing him like a dark halo. He was dressed more casually, in dark trousers and a cashmere sweater, but he still radiated that unapproachable aura of power. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "I need to talk to you." Amanda shot her a nervous look. "Sarah, you don't have to," but Sarah knew she did. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. "It's okay. I'll be right back." She stepped out into the cool night air. The street was loud with the sounds of the city, a stark contrast to the tense silence that fell between them. "Your mother's father," Patrick began, getting straight to the point. His name was Edward Miller. It wasn't a question. Sarah's heart stuttered. "How did you know that?" "Yes, so what?" He was an engineer. In 1968, he filed a patent for a turbine gearing system. Patrick watched her face, carefully gauging her reaction. "I don't know anything about that," Sarah said honestly. "He worked on things, I guess. The details are fuzzy. My grandfather, Alexander Vance Montgomery, released a turbine based on an identical design a few years later. It made my family a fortune." Miller withdrew his patent and accepted a cash payment. The accusation was so cynical, so cruel, it took her breath away. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "My mother is fighting for her life. You think this is about money? This is about her honor, about the honor of a man you just admitted your family probably stole from." For the first time, Patrick looked taken aback. He didn't see a grifter. He saw a daughter, pushed to the edge. "My grandfather told my mother that ring was proof," Sarah continued, her voice rising. "Proof that he was wronged. He didn't take a bribe. He was threatened. Forced to sign away his life's work to protect his family. From men like your grandfather." "There were 2 rings," Patrick said, his voice losing its hard edge. "My great-grandfather had 2 made, one for himself and one for his brother, Stephen. The family story is that Stephen was a traitor who was cast out." "Was your grandfather friends with a man named Stephen Montgomery?" Sarah stared at him, bewildered. "Stephen Montgomery? I've never heard that name in my life." "My mother has the ring," Sarah said, her resolve hardening. "You have your story. I have mine, and I'm going to find out which one is the truth." Patrick gave her a single sharp nod. "So will I." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah with the chilling realization that her quest for the truth was now dangerously linked to his. The confrontation left Sarah shaken, but determined. She had defended her family's honor, but his questions echoed in her mind. She returned to the hospital the next day with a new sense of urgency. "Mom," Sarah began, pulling a chair close. "We need to talk. For real this time. No more secrets." Carol sighed and closed her book of poetry. "I knew this day would come." She told her the real story. How Edward had been a trusting genius. How he'd developed his turbine system in his spare time. How he'd confided in a colleague who betrayed him. How 2 men had come to their house, with photographs of the family and veiled threats. "They didn't lay a hand on him," Carol said, her voice dropping. "They were smarter than that. They put photographs on our kitchen table. Pictures of me playing in the schoolyard. Pictures of my mother leaving the grocery store. The men told them what a beautiful family they had, and what a shame it would be if anything happened. Then they put papers in front of Edward, an NDA, and an envelope full of cash. He signed everything," Carol continued. "What choice did he have? He was a broken man, Sarah. They didn't just steal his work. They stole his soul. But the ring, Mom. Where did Stephen come in?" Carol shivered at the name. Edward never said the Montgomery name. He just called him my friend. His only friend in that terrible time. After Edward was forced out, a man had sought him out. He introduced himself only as Stephen. He was a wanderer, an outcast, but he had an artist's soul and a hatred for the corporate greed that had destroyed Edward. This Stephen told your grandfather that he, too, had been betrayed by a powerful family. He understood what it was like to have everything stolen by your own blood. They became friends, 2 broken men finding solace in each other's company. Before Stephen left for good, he had given Edward the ring. he told him. "This represents a shared dream between brothers. It was forged in hope and stained by greed. It belongs to the wronged, not the wrongdoer. Keep it, as proof that integrity has a value money cannot buy." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle slotting into place. Stephen Montgomery wasn't a traitor. He was another victim, and he had given his ring, his birthright, to another wronged man as an act of solidarity. The story was so much deeper and more tragic than she had imagined. Meanwhile, Patrick was at his family's ancestral home, a sprawling stone mansion an hour outside the city. He rarely came here. It felt more like a museum than a home, filled with portraits of severe-faced ancestors. In the library, he ran into his cousin, Robert Montgomery. Robert was a few years older, with a practiced smile and the easy charm of a man who had never worked a day in his life. He managed the family's charitable foundation. "Patrick, to what do we owe the honor?" Robert said, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. "I'm looking for information," Patrick said, cutting to the chase. "About Great-Uncle Stephen?" Robert's smile wavered. "Stephen? The black sheep? That old ghost story? What's gotten into you?" I have reason to believe the story is true, and I need to know the details. The real details, not the sanitized version." "Well, you know the legend. He was the younger brother, the artist, the dreamer. Alexander was the pragmatist, the builder. Apparently, Stephen accused Alexander of stealing his ideas for the company's first successes, tried to stage a boardroom coup. When it failed, he vanished. But not before stealing a valuable ring and supposedly selling company secrets to a rival." Robert sighed dramatically. "A classic tale of sibling rivalry and betrayal. It's why the line of succession has always been so rigidly defined. This was the story Patrick had always known. But hearing it now, it felt thin. Theatrical. And, you believe that? Why shouldn't I?" Robert said with a shrug. "It's our history. It explains why the family closed ranks. Why grandfather Alexander was so aggressive in his business dealings. He was protecting the family legacy from vultures, from another betrayal." He leaned forward. "Why the sudden interest? Did some descendant of his crawl out of the woodwork looking for a handout?" The question was casual, but the look in Robert's eyes was sharp, probing. Patrick felt a sudden, instinctive distrust. "It's a private matter," Patrick said, his voice curt. Of course," Robert said, leaning back, the charming smile returning. "Well, if you want to dig up old bones, be my guest. The old family papers are in the West Wing study, Grandfather Alexander's private correspondence. Have fun. Just don't be surprised if the ghost you find is uglier than you imagined." Patrick left Robert with his brandy and went to the study. The room was dusty, unused for years. He found the boxes of letters, tied with faded ribbons. For hours he sorted through them, reading his great-grandfather's elegant script. Most of it was business. But then he found a series of letters from the late 1960s, addressed to his grandfather's head of security. The contents made him feel sick. There were updates on the surveillance of a man named Edward Miller, reports on his daughter's school schedule, his wife's daily routine, and then a final chilling memo. Subject: Miller has been neutralized. Asset secured. He is no longer a threat. Neutralized. Asset secured. Sarah Jenkins's story was true. All of it. His family's fortune was built on theft and cemented with threats. But as he kept digging through the papers, he found something else. Something that didn't fit either his story or Sarah's. It was a single, folded note, separate from the letters, tucked into the back of a ledger. It was in his grandfather's handwriting, but it was frantic, almost unreadable. He knows. He found me. He can ruin everything. Stephen is the key. Must protect the name. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment about this story and rate it from 1 to 10. How are you feeling? If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of peace and reflection as you follow this healing story and its journey of courage and justice. The note was undated. Who was he? And who was our Robert? It seemed too convenient. And what did Stephen is the key mean? Stephen was supposed to be a ghost, a long-vanished traitor. But this note, written decades after Stephen's disappearance, spoke of him as a present, active threat. Patrick stood in the silent, dusty study, holding two conflicting testaments. In one hand, the sordid truth of his grandfather's crime against Edward Miller. In the other, a cryptic note suggesting a deeper, more complex conspiracy was at play. The story was no longer just about his grandfather and Sarah's. There was a third player, a hidden thread, and the name of that thread was Stephen. The discovery of his grandfather's note threw Patrick into a state of focused obsession. He knows. He found me. Stephen is the key. It was a code, and Patrick knew he couldn't decipher it alone. The animosity between him and Sarah had melted away, replaced by the grim reality that they were the only two people with a stake in the whole truth. He found her where he knew she'd be, the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee with the same haunted expression he saw in the mirror. He sat across from her, placing a thin file on the table between them. "Your mother was right," he said, his voice devoid of its usual authority, filled instead with a quiet gravity. "About all of it. The threats, the coercion. My grandfather put your family through hell." He pushed the file forward. It contained copies of the surveillance reports on the Miller family. "This is the proof." Sarah opened the file, her hands trembling as she read the cold, clinical descriptions of her mother as a little girl, being watched. Her face went pale. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my story is falling apart. And so is yours," Patrick said. "There's more." He told her about the note. "Stephen is the key. It was written by my grandfather, long after your grandfather was silenced. He was afraid of someone who knew the truth about Stephen." Sarah frowned. "But Stephen gave my grandfather the ring. He was an outcast, a victim, like Edward." "That's what he told your grandfather," Patrick countered. "But what if that wasn't the whole story? We have two stories, yours and mine, but they're both based on what we were told, by people who were either betrayed or were lying. We need a primary source, an objective truth. Where do we find that?" "The rings," Patrick said, a spark of inspiration in his eyes. "They're the one constant. They're the origin point. My great-grandfather commissioned them from a Parisian artisan, Michel Dubois." An hour later, Sarah found herself in a place she could never have imagined. Patrick Vance Montgomery's 80th floor office. On a massive screen, covering one wall, was a high-resolution image of a page from an ancient, leather-bound ledger. As they examined the 1922 entry for Alexander's commission, Sarah saw something the translator had missed. "Gardien de l'âme," Sarah said slowly, pointing at the screen. "That's not dreamer. That means guardian of the soul." Patrick magnified the image. "Guardian of the soul," he repeated, the words feeling heavy, significant. A builder of an empire and a guardian of its soul. It wasn't a rivalry. It was supposed to be a partnership. A balance. Everything. Changed. As they scanned further, down the page, Patrick noticed a tiny notation next to the entry, added in a different hand and different ink. It was dated 1945. Received correspondence from Mr. Stephen Vance Montgomery. He requests a modification to the second ring. To the interior of the band. He is a Montgomery no more. He is something else. The note continued. He asked me to engrave one name. Edward. "Edward," Sarah breathed. "My grandfather's name. But this was 1945. My grandfather wouldn't have known Stephen for another 20 years. "It's not your grandfather's name," Patrick said, a sudden shocking realization dawning on him. He typed furiously at his keyboard, pulling up his family's genealogical records, going back further than he ever had. His great-grandfather, Alexander Vance Montgomery, then his great-grandmother, Beatrice, and then he found her family tree. Her maiden name was Bowen, and her father, Alexander's wealthy shipping magnate father-in-law, who had financed Alexander's first ventures and who had died in 1944, was named Edward Bowen. The truth hit them both like a physical blow. The inscription wasn't for Sarah's grandfather. It was a memorial. Stephen was reclaiming his middle name, the only part of his identity his brother couldn't take from him. The twist was so profound, so complete, that the room fell silent. The entire family history was a lie. Stephen wasn't the younger brother. Based on his birth year, he was the older brother. He should have been the heir. Alexander was the younger son, the builder. And Patrick's grandfather wasn't just Alexander's son, he was the second son. Stephen should have inherited everything. Sarah's grandfather hadn't met some random outcast. He had met Stephen Edward Vance Montgomery, the true disinherited heir to the Montgomery fortune. And Stephen hadn't given him just a token of solidarity. He had given him his ring, his own ring, engraved with his own name, for safekeeping. It was a piece of evidence, a dormant claim to an empire. The following section begins the abrupt, contradictory narrative from the source text. The revelation that her father was probably alive, a prisoner in a gilded cage, changed the entire dynamic of their investigation. It was no longer a search for justice. It was a rescue mission. Stephen Miller used his investigative skills to dig into the Cedar Creek Clinic. What he found was a fortress. It was nestled in a remote, wooded valley, surrounded by state-of-the-art security, pressure plates, infrared cameras, and a private security force with military-grade training. Getting in the front door was impossible without a court order, which they couldn't get without concrete proof Edward was inside. And they couldn't get that proof without getting inside. It was a perfect catch-22, designed by a man who left nothing to chance. As they strategized in Stephen's apartment, the pressure from Patrick Montgomery began to mount. It started subtly. Sarah's unemployment application was inexplicably denied due to a clerical error. Then, Stephen's blog was hit with a series of sophisticated cyber attacks, repeatedly crashing the site. They were being watched. The intimidation escalated one night when Sarah returned home. The lock on her apartment door was broken, the wood splintered. Inside, the place had been tossed. It wasn't a robbery. Her small TV and her mother's jewelry were untouched, but her father's boxes from the attic had been rifled through, notebooks scattered across the floor. The message was clear. We know who you are. We know what you're looking for. Stop. Carol was terrified. Sarah, please, she begged, her voice frail. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. Patrick is too powerful. I can't lose you too. Looking at her mother's frightened face, Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly consumed by a defiant rage. That's why we have to do this, Mom, she said, her voice low and fierce. They're not just protecting a lie anymore. They're scared. We're getting close. The break-in solidified their resolve. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Their only hope was Walter Schmidt, the old lab technician who had worked with Edward and Patrick decades ago. They called him, explaining the situation. The old technician, racked with guilt and horrified by the intimidation tactics, finally agreed to help them more directly. There might be one way in, Walter said over a secure line Stephen had set up. The oldest wing of the facility, the original sanatorium, has an outdated HVAC system. I know this because Ilias Innovations bid on a contract to upgrade it years ago, before everything. It was the sliver of hope they needed. Stephen, using a fake ID and a plausible cover story about historical preservation, managed to get access to the archived county blueprints. He spent a day poring over the decades-old schematics and found it, a large ventilation outflow duct on the west side of the building, hidden by a thicket of overgrown woods. According to the plans, it was large enough for a person to crawl through and led directly into the basement service tunnels of the oldest long-term residential wing. Their plan was desperate and dangerous. Stephen would act as lookout and communications hub from a rental car parked a mile away. Sarah, being smaller and more agile, would be the one to go inside. The night they chose was dark and moonless, with a forecast of rain to help cover any noise. As they drove toward the remote facility, the silence in the car was thick with tension. "You don't have to do this, Sarah," Stephen said quietly. "What other way is there, Stephen?" she countered. "He's been in there for 10 years. Every day we wait is another day he loses." They parked on an unpaved logging trail hidden from the main road. Stephen set up his surveillance equipment, a laptop linked to a signal booster and a police scanner. "Comms check," he said, his voice all business. "I hear you," Sarah whispered into the tiny mic on her collar. "You have a 30-minute window, Max. After that, the night shift security patrol does a perimeter sweep. Get in, find him, get a picture, and get out. Do not engage. Do not get caught. Your safety is the priority." Sarah nodded, her heart feeling like a drum against her ribs. She slung on a small backpack containing a flashlight, a multi-tool, and the burner phone. "Good luck," Stephen said, his eyes full of a concern that went beyond the story. She gave him a small, tight smile. "See you in 30. Then she slipped out of the car and disappeared into the dark, tangled woods. A ghost, moving silently toward the dragon's lair. The crawl through the ventilation duct was claustrophobic and terrifying. The cold, damp metal scraped against her clothes, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin beam of her flashlight. Cobwebs brushed against her face, and the air was stale with the smell of decay and disinfectant. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a grate ahead. Using her multi-tool, she carefully undid the rusted bolts and lowered herself into the quiet, cavernous basement of the Cedar Creek Clinic. The service tunnels were a maze of pipes and ductwork, dimly lit by caged emergency lights. A low hum, the sound of the building's life support, vibrated through the concrete floor. "I'm in," she whispered into her mic. "Copied." Stephen's voice crackled in her ear. "According to the blueprints, you need to find maintenance stairway C. It will take you to the first floor of the West Wing. Stay quiet. They have roving orderlies." Navigating by the faded stencils on the walls, Sarah found the stairwell. She ascended cautiously, all her senses on high alert. The air grew warmer, the smell of disinfectant stronger. She emerged into a hallway that was nothing like the grimy basement. Here, everything was sterile and eerily quiet. The floors were polished marble, the walls a soothing cream, and soft, indirect lighting gave the corridor a serene, dreamlike quality. It was a beautiful, silent prison. The doors to the rooms were heavy oak, bearing no names, only numbers. Each had a small, reinforced glass window and a slot for food trays. "I'm in the West Wing. It's quiet. Too quiet." "That's the high-security pavilion," Stephen said. "Patients here are kept in isolation. Walter said they're often heavily sedated. Start checking the rooms. You have 20 minutes left." Heart-pounding, Sarah began her grim task, moving from door to door, peering through the small windows. In the first room, an elderly woman sat staring at a blank TV screen. In the next, a man was sleeping fitfully, muttering in his sleep. Each room held a person, lost to the world, their fortunes paying to keep them out of sight and out of mind. Then she came to room 113. She looked through the glass, and her world stopped. The room was sparse, a bed, a small table, a chair. Sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to the door, was a man with thinning gray hair. He was gaunt, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound defeat. He was sketching in a small notebook with a pencil, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he turned his head slightly, and Sarah saw his profile in the dim light. The face was older, thinner, etched with lines of sorrow she had never known. But it was him. The high forehead, the shape of his nose, the gentle curve of his brow. It was her father. A sob caught in her throat, and she clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle it. Tears streamed down her face. He was alive. After 10 years of believing he was dead, of mourning him, he was here. "Stephen," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I found him. It's him. It's okay, Sarah. It's okay." Stephen's voice was a firm anchor in her emotional storm. "Get the picture. You need proof. With shaking hands, she raised the phone. She had to see his face. She tapped lightly on the reinforced glass. "Dad?" The sound was barely audible, but in the deep silence of the hallway, it was enough. Edward Miller flinched. He turned slowly, his eyes cloudy and unfocused, as if looking at her from a great distance. There was a flicker of confusion, a ghost of recognition, but it was buried under a decade of medication and isolation. "Dad, it's me," she whispered, pressing her hand against the cold glass. "It's Sarah," his brow furrowed. The name seemed to stir something deep inside. He took a hesitant step toward the door, his eyes trying to pierce through the fog of his consciousness. It was in that moment. As he looked at her, his face filled with a heart-wrenching mix of confusion and longing, that she got the picture. A clear shot of his face. The proof. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the end of the hall. A metal door swinging shut. "Sarah, you have to go. Now." Stephen's voice was sharp in her ear. "Patrol's coming." Panic seized her. She couldn't leave him. Not again. But she knew if she was caught, they would both be lost forever. The proof on her phone would be destroyed, and she would be silenced, just as he had been. "I love you, Dad," she whispered through the glass. "I'm coming back for you. I promise." She didn't know if he understood, but as she turned to flee, she saw his hand rise and press against the glass, mirroring hers. Adrenaline surged through her. She sprinted back the way she came, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. She scrambled down the maintenance stairs, her lungs burning, and plunged back into the dark labyrinth of the basement. She found the ventilation duct, hoisted herself in, and crawled frantically back toward the outside world. When she finally tumbled out of the duct back into the cold, damp woods, she was gasping for air, covered in grime and tears. She ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, until she saw the welcome silhouette of Stephen's rental car. She yanked the door open and collapsed into the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. "I got it," she gasped, holding up the phone like a holy relic. "I got the proof." Stephen didn't speak. He just put a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she sobbed. For the father she had lost, for the father she had found, and for the fight that was yet to come. They had breached the dragon's lair. Now they had to figure out how to slay the dragon. The photograph changed everything. It was grainy, taken through thick glass, but it was undeniable. The man in room 113 was Edward Miller. Stephen Miller knew this image, combined with Walter Schmidt's testimony and the falsified documentation, was enough. He didn't just have a story. He had a bomb that could blow a corporate empire to pieces. He worked feverishly for the next 48 hours, holed up in his apartment with Sarah. He wrote the article of his life, a masterpiece of investigative journalism that laid out the entire sordid tale. He didn't publish it on his fringe blog. This was too big. He called in the one favor he had left in the world, with a former colleague, a senior editor at the New York Times, one of the few who had privately believed him 6 years ago. He sent the encrypted file with one simple message: redemption. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. It didn't just make a splash. It was a global tsunami. Whereas Edward Miller became the #1 trending topic worldwide within an hour. Montgomery Holdings stock plummeted in pre-market trading, wiping out billions of dollars in value before the opening bell. News vans surrounded the company's glittering headquarters and the gates of the Cedar Creek Clinic. Patrick Vance Montgomery was blindsided. He issued a furious denial, calling it a vicious, baseless attack orchestrated by a disgraced journalist and a delusional young woman. But the photographic evidence was too compelling, the narrative too detailed. His carefully constructed wall of lies, which had stood for 20 years, crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. Federal agents, armed with a warrant issued on the strength of Stephen's article, raided the Cedar Creek Clinic that afternoon. They found Edward Miller in his room, just as Sarah had described. He was disoriented and weak, but his mind, though clouded by years of improper medication, was still there. When a female agent gently asked him his name, he looked at her and said, with a clarity that stunned everyone, "My name is Edward Miller, and I want to see my daughter." The reunion happened not in a prison, but in a secure private hospital. When Sarah walked in, Her father was sitting up in bed, free of his sedatives for the first time in a decade. He looked at her, and this time there was no fog in his eyes, only recognition and a deep, overwhelming love. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice raspy, "you found me." She ran to his side, and they held each other, years of stolen time and silent grief melting away in one embrace. Carol was there too, holding her husband's hand. For the first time in 10 years, her own illness seemed to fade into the background in the face of this miracle. The fall of Patrick Vance Montgomery was as swift as it was total. He was arrested that night, trying to flee the country on his private jet. The legal battle was immense, but the evidence was insurmountable. Walter Schmidt's testimony, combined with the doctored medical records from the facility and the damning financial trail leading from Patrick's shell companies directly to the Cedar Creek Clinic, sealed his fate. He was convicted of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and a dozen counts of fraud. The empire built on his lie was dismantled. Montgomery Holdings was forced into bankruptcy and restructuring, but from its ashes, something new was born. The patents for Project Chimera, now properly returned to Edward Miller, became the foundation of a new company, Miller Carter Energy. Stephen Miller, his reputation not just restored but legendary, took a place on the board, vowing to ensure the company always operated with the transparency he had fought for. And at the helm, as the new CEO, was Sarah Miller. She had traded her waitress uniform for a business suit, but she hadn't lost an ounce of the fire that had driven her. She was no longer just the daughter of a genius. She was a leader in her own right. Months later, Sarah stood with her father and Stephen in a clean, brightly lit lab, looking at a new schematic on a screen. Her father, though still recovering, had the old spark back in his eyes. "The containment field," Edward said, pointing at the screen. "I finally figured out the stabilization equation. Took me 10 years of thinking in that room, but I solved it." Sarah smiled, a real brilliant smile. "I know, Dad," she said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "We're going to change the world. For real this time." The following is the requested YouTube call to action outro. Sarah Miller's story is a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always fight its way to the light. It's a story about the unbreakable bond between a father and a daughter, and the incredible courage it takes for one person to stand up to an empire of lies. Sarah's journey from a heartbroken waitress struggling to survive to a powerful CEO who reclaimed her family's legacy shows that our circumstances don't define us. Our choices do. She chose to fight, to believe, and to never give up on the ghost of the man who taught her to look at the stars. This story proves that true family values can't be bought with money, that justice always finds its way, and that unconditional love can overcome any obstacle, no matter how powerful the enemy. In a world where power is often valued more than humanity, we need more stories like this. Stories that remind us that family is sacred, that truth is stronger than lies, and that one brave person can change the fate of generations. If this story of resilience, justice, and unbreakable family love moved you, please help us share it with the world. Click the like button, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will inspire and captivate you. Your support helps us continue to tell the stories that matter, stories that prove good always triumphs over evil, and that true family love can move mountains. Because in the end, it's not riches that define us, but the bonds we forge with those we love. Sarah's story teaches us that it's never too late to fight for justice, that we must never surrender to the powerful, and that family always finds its way back home.